So this is the second video in the Cold War in Asia series, and we've looked at China and we've looked at Korea. So now we're looking at the Vietnam War, which is another example of a proxy war, and where military conflict actually evolved from the two superpowers getting involved in I guess, an internal or a civil war that was going on in a third world country. So Vietnam in the early 20th century was a French colony. It was part of what was called French Indochina. And then during World War II, it was actually controlled by the Japanese. So similarly to Korea, once the Japanese were defeated in World War II, it left a power vacuum where lots of different forces tried to regain control of that now, I guess, unoccupied territory after the Japanese had left. And so after World War II, the struggle for the Vietnamese to gain independence back from France resumed. The communist movement in Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, and these freedom fighters were called the Viet Minh. And Ho Chi Minh would become a very significant figure in the Vietnam War. And so Vietnam finally won its independence from France in 1954. And following that familiar pattern that we've looked at a few times now, the domino theory, the United States became worried that Vietnam, being a neighbour of China, which had fallen to communism in 1949, they were worried Vietnam would actually fall as well. And so again, these superpowers wanted to be proactive in getting into the region and installing what they'd call sympathetic governments and governments that they could control. And so here's a good depiction of the domino theory again. Okay, the United States, through foreign aid, believed that they could prop up these struggling nations and help them avoid the temptation of communism. Okay, so through the Marshall Plan, that's donating a lot of money to communities everywhere around the world that are trying to resist communism. Okay, and this is another example of that. And so the country was split into two: North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam, which was had a Western influence or democratic. But the communists were gaining support in the South, which wasn't even the communist half, due to a particularly incompetent ruler that the United States installed, Diem, and you can see him down below there, who started a war against Buddhists, and he was trying to really clamp down on different minority groups in the South. And so the communists started to have a lot of influence in southern Vietnam, and America basically needed any excuse to actually send in more troops and take more decisive action. And so in 1964, there's what's become known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where two American destroyers were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and you can see it there just off the shore of Vietnam. And there's a lot of debate and conspiracy as to whether this attack actually occurred or whether this was some sort of publicity stunt that America created to actually give themselves the excuse to go to war. But after this so-called attack, US Congress authorized troops to go into South Vietnam and help prevent the spread of communism. And so a couple of years later, by the late 1960s, President Johnson had sent 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam to fight against the Viet Cong, the communist forces, in South Vietnam. So not necessarily against the North, they were just trying to rid the South of the communist influences. And the Vietnam War, in retrospect, turned into a long, expensive, drawn-out stalemate for the United States, and it wasn't going to be the quick, decisive victory that they were expecting. Being a world superpower, a nuclear power with the most advanced technology in the world, they're expecting to go in and fight against these third world farmers who, had no sort of funding or technology behind them, no strategy. They thought this would be very quick and easy, but the United States basically got bogged down in a war in Vietnam for a decade and had no clear victory or any sort of resolution to the communist issue in Vietnam. There were lots of problems for the United States when they went to fight Vietnam. So most of the Vietnamese actually liked the Viet Cong because they represented the ongoing struggle against the oppressors. So originally the French, and now the Americans, who they saw were coming in. So the Viet Cong had a lot of popularity throughout the whole country, not just in the north. Often because of the nature of the warfare in Vietnam, what's called guerrilla warfare, where often there's no uniforms. It's just village people basically fighting in lots of skirmishes and camouflage in the jungle. And so the United States weren't actually sure who they were fighting against. They weren't sure who was the enemy and who was friendly, because there was no way of identifying who these soldiers were that they were actually competing against. The Americans were out of their depth in terms of the terrain. They didn't know the local uh, the geography of Vietnam, which had very very dense jungle and a monsoon-like climate. And through this jungle cover, the Vietnamese were able to smuggle a lot of weapons and move people and supplies, through the cover of this terrain, which made it very difficult for the United States to deal with. Um, and so this was a huge failure for the United States. Not to mention the propaganda um, loss that goes with it. Okay, them trying to seemingly pick a fight with um, a very inexperienced, poor group, and they ended up basically getting embarrassed by it. And so this is a relatively dark chapter in American history. And there wasn't, unlike World War II, there wasn't a clear victory at the end. There was nothing to celebrate, and often the Vietnam veterans were really disrespected when they came home. And on the home front, the Vietnam War caused a lot of dissent and a lot of sort of counterculture developed in the 1960s, where there's the hippie movement, and it was really a protest movement to protest against this government greed. And lots of people, for the first time, really could see that their government was, I guess, pursuing the wrong agenda overseas, and people found their voice. And so it was a time of a lot of criticism of the American government. And like I said, the world became increasingly unpopular in the United States until the United States eventually adopted a policy of Vietnamization, where they wanted to gradually withdraw their troops and hand back control very slowly to the Vietnamese people, as they took their own people and resources out of Vietnam. And very, very soon, communists took over the whole of Vietnam. And in 1975, Vietnam was united as one communist country. Um, and so, in lots of different respects, this was a failure for America, and for the Truman Doctrine, and for the Marshall Plan. And it shows that just having money doesn't necessarily, give you a victory in an example like this. And the hearts and the minds and the resolve of the Vietnamese people was too strong for the Americans to counter. And so, in the end, the domino theory proved out to be, a reality to a certain extent. We know that China fell to communism in 1949, North Korea in 1953, after that Korean peninsula was permanently split in two at the 38th parallel. Vietnam in 1975, once the North and the South reunified under a communist banner. And Laos, its small neighbour as well, which is just on the inside here of Vietnam, actually fell to communism during that same time period, during the Vietnam War, because of its proximity to fighting and the communist ideas that spread over the border. So that's a quick snapshot at three significant arenas, I guess, in Asia during the Cold War. The fall of China to communism, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And these are an example of proxy wars, and we've talked about the Cold War being a cold conflict in terms of there not being any direct conflict between the two superpowers. But this is an example how they've both indirectly used these countries almost like puppets to assert their ideological powers over these regions.